In the annals of military history, few warrior cultures have captured the imagination quite like the Zulu Kingdom. Their disciplined regiments, innovative tactics, and fierce courage made them one of the most formidable fighting forces in 19th century Africa. Under the leadership of King Shaka Kasenzangakona, the Zulu had built an empire through military prowess that would become legendary. But every great military power must eventually face its reckoning. For the Zulu, that moment came on July 4th, 1879, at a place called Ulundi, the very heart of their kingdom. This is the story of the greatest Zulu defeat, a battle that would mark the end of Zulu independence and forever change the course of South African history. To understand the magnitude of the Zulu defeat at Ulundi, we must first understand what made the Zulu military machine so formidable. The story begins in the early 19th century with one man, Shaka Zulu. Born around 1787, Shaka transformed the Zulu from a minor clan into a dominant regional power. His military innovations were revolutionary. He replaced the traditional throwing spear with the ikalwa, a short stabbing spear designed for close combat. He developed the buffalo horns formation, a tactical masterpiece where the main force, or chest, would engage the enemy head-on while the horns, two flanking regiments, would encircle and surround the opponent. Meanwhile, the loins, a reserve force, would sit with their backs to the battle, ready to reinforce wherever needed. Shaka also instituted rigorous military training and discipline. Young men were organized into age-based regiments called amabuto. These warriors lived in military kraals, trained constantly, and were forbidden to marry until they had washed their spears in battle. This created a highly motivated, intensely loyal, and extraordinarily disciplined fighting force. By the time of Shaka's assassination in 1828, the Zulu Kingdom controlled a vast territory in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. His successors, Dingane and later Mpande, maintained this military tradition, though with varying degrees of success. In 1872, Cetshwayo Kampande became king. Intelligent, charismatic, and politically astute, Cetshwayo understood that his kingdom faced growing threats, particularly from British colonial expansion. The British had already annexed neighboring territories, and Cetshwayo knew it was only a matter of time before they turned their attention to Zululand. Despite his attempts at diplomacy, Cetshwayo maintained and even strengthened the traditional Zulu military system. By the late 1870s, he could call upon approximately 40,000 warriors, men trained from youth in the art of war, loyal to their king, and proud of their warrior heritage. The road to Ulundi began with British imperial ambition. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, was determined to create a confederation of British colonies and African kingdoms under British control. The independent Zulu Kingdom, with its powerful military, stood as the primary obstacle to this vision. Frere needed a pretext for war. He found it in a series of border incidents and disputes over territory. In December 1878, Frere issued an ultimatum to King Cetshwayo that he knew would be impossible to accept. The demands included disbanding the Zulu military system, accepting a British resident in Zululand, and paying substantial fines for alleged border violations. Cetshwayo was given 30 days to comply. When the deadline passed with no Zulu acceptance, Britain had its justification for invasion. In January 1879, Lord Chelmsford led a British invasion force of approximately 15,000 men, including British regulars, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries, across the border into Zululand. The British were confident. They possessed modern rifles, artillery, and what they believed was superior military discipline. They were about to receive a brutal education. On January 22, 1879, at a place called Isandlwana, approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors descended upon a British camp. What followed was one of the most devastating defeats in British military history. Of the roughly 1,800 British and colonial troops at Isandlwana, over 1,300 were killed. The Zulu warriors, using their traditional tactics and extraordinary courage, had overwhelmed a modern European army. News of Isandlwana shocked the British Empire. How could savages armed primarily with spears defeat professional soldiers with rifles and artillery? The answer lay in Zulu tactical brilliance, intimate knowledge of the terrain, numerical superiority, and the sheer courage and determination of warriors defending their homeland. Later that same day, at a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, approximately 150 British soldiers successfully defended against several thousand Zulu warriors. While this defensive victory provided some redemption for British military pride, it couldn't obscure the disaster at Isandlwana. Isandlwana was, in many ways, the Zulu military's greatest triumph, but it would also sow the seeds of their ultimate defeat. The British, humiliated and enraged, would return with overwhelming force, determined to crush Zulu power once and for all. The disaster at Isandlwana demanded a response. The British government, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, despite initial reservations about Freire's aggressive policies, had no choice but to support a renewed military campaign. British prestige was at stake. Reinforcements poured into southern Africa. Additional regular troops, cavalry, artillery, and improved logistics. Lord Chelmsford, his reputation in tatters, was given a chance to redeem himself. He would lead a new invasion, but this time there would be no mistakes. The British adopted a more cautious strategy. Columns would move more slowly, maintain better communication, and never camp without proper fortification. They would use their superior firepower more effectively and avoid the tactical overconfidence that had led to Isandlwana. Throughout the early months of 1879, the British methodically advanced into Zululand. There were several engagements: Hlobane, Kambula, Gingindlovu, where Zulu warriors displayed their traditional courage, but increasingly faced the reality of British firepower. At Kambula in particular, massed Zulu charges were torn apart by disciplined rifle volleys and artillery fire. King Cetshwayo, watching his warriors die in these battles, attempted diplomacy. He sent messages offering peace, but the British were no longer interested in negotiation. They wanted complete submission. Chelmsford's objective was clear: march to Ulundi, the royal kraal and capital of the Zulu Kingdom, and destroy Zulu military power forever. Ulundi sat in a valley, surrounded by hills, in the heart of Zululand. It was more than just a military target. It was the symbolic center of Zulu power, where the king held court and where the greatest warriors gathered. To capture and destroy Ulundi would be to tear out the very heart of the Zulu Kingdom. By late June 1879, Chelmsford had assembled a formidable force. He had learned from his mistakes. This army included approximately 4,200 British troops and 1,000 African auxiliaries. But more importantly, it was properly organized, well supplied, and equipped with Gatling guns and artillery. The British were taking no chances. Chelmsford planned to use a hollow square formation, soldiers arranged in a rectangular formation, multiple ranks deep, with supply wagons and non-combatants in the center. This formation, while static, allowed soldiers to fire in all directions and was extremely difficult for attacking forces to penetrate. It was a defensive formation designed to maximize British firepower while minimizing vulnerability to the Zulus' traditional encircling tactics. July 4th, 1879, dawned clear and hot. Lord Chelmsford's army broke camp early and began their advance toward Ulundi. The British moved in their predetermined formation, a massive rectangle of disciplined soldiers bristling with rifles and artillery. Cavalry squadrons probed ahead and protected the flanks. As they approached the valley where Ulundi stood, the British could see Zulu warriors gathering on the surrounding hills. Estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 Zulu warriors had assembled to defend their capital. These were the cream of the Zulu military, experienced warriors from elite regiments, many of whom had fought at Isandlwana, men defending not just territory, but their entire way of life. The Zulu strategy was traditional. Use the buffalo horns formation, encircle the British, and attack from all sides simultaneously. It had worked before. Why wouldn't it work now? But the Zulu faced a terrible dilemma. Their tactics required mobility and close combat. They needed to get close enough to use their assegais. The British, however, had positioned themselves in open ground, where their rifles and artillery could inflict maximum casualties on any approaching force. King Cetshwayo, watching from a distance, reportedly tried to stop the attack. Some historical accounts suggest he knew this battle was unwinnable, that the warriors would be slaughtered by British firepower. But the warriors' blood was up. They had defended their nation throughout this war. They would not fail to defend their king's capital. Around 9 a.m., the Zulu attack began. From multiple directions, thousands of warriors advanced toward the British square. They moved with the discipline and courage that had made them legendary. The left and right horns attempted to encircle the formation, while the chest moved forward in a frontal assault. But they were advancing across open ground against modern weaponry. The British opened fire at approximately 300 yards. The Martini Henry rifles, firing .577 caliber rounds, were devastatingly effective. Volleys crashed out from all four sides of the square. Artillery added to the carnage, 9-pounder guns firing case shot, essentially giant shotgun shells, cut swathes through the Zulu ranks. The Gatling guns, early machine guns, added their mechanical chatter to the cacophony. Zulu warriors fell in their hundreds, then thousands. But still they advanced. This was more than military discipline. This was cultural imperative, personal honor, loyalty to their king and their comrades. Warriors who had trained together since childhood, who had lived in the same military kraals, who had shared every aspect of their lives, would not abandon each other or their duty, even in the face of certain death. Some warriors got within 70 yards of the British lines. A few incredibly brave or fortunate individuals even reached within 30 yards before being cut down. But none breached the square. The firepower was simply too intense. The British soldiers, in 4 ranks, could maintain almost continuous fire. As one rank fired, another reloaded. The Zulu could not close the distance. The attack lasted approximately 30 minutes. 30 minutes of continuous, devastating firepower. 30 minutes during which thousands of brave men charged into what was essentially a wall of lead. When it became clear that the attack had failed, when the casualties became unbearable, the Zulu warriors began to withdraw. This was the moment Chelmsford had anticipated. He ordered his cavalry, the 17th Lancers and irregular mounted units, to pursue. What followed was a brutal chase across the valley and into the hills. Zulu warriors, many of them wounded, exhausted from the attack, were hunted down and killed. The cavalry showed little mercy. This was about more than military victory. This was about revenge for Isandlwana, about breaking Zulu power completely and permanently. By late morning, the battle was over. The British had achieved a complete and decisive victory. British casualties were remarkably light, 15 killed and 78 wounded. Zulu casualties were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors died at Ulundi, with hundreds more wounded. Chelmsford ordered the royal kraal burned, as flames consumed the circular structures where Zulu kings had ruled. As smoke rose into the African sky, the symbolic destruction was complete. The greatest Zulu defeat was not just a military loss. It was the destruction of Zulu independence and the Zulu way of life. The Battle of Ulundi effectively ended the Anglo-Zulu War, though sporadic resistance continued for several more weeks. King Cetshwayo fled, but was eventually captured in August 1879. He was exiled to Cape Town, though he would later be allowed to return to a reduced kingdom, powerless and under British supervision. The British divided Zululand into 13 separate chiefdoms, deliberately fragmenting Zulu power. The great military system, the Amabutho regiments, the warrior traditions, the centralized kingdom, was dismantled. Young men were no longer called to military service. The regimental kraals were abandoned. A way of life that had defined the Zulu for generations was forcibly ended. But why was Ulundi such a devastating defeat? Isandlwana had shown that the Zulu could defeat British forces. What made Ulundi different? Several factors contributed to the outcome. First, the British learned from their mistakes. The hollow square formation, while static, was nearly impenetrable when properly executed. The Zulu tactical system, brilliant in many contexts, was poorly suited to attacking such a defensive formation across open ground. Second, the technological gap had become decisive. At Isandlwana, the British had allowed themselves to be caught in unfavorable terrain with inadequate defensive preparations. At Ulundi, they chose the battlefield and maximized their firepower advantage. The Martini Henry rifle could fire 10 to 12 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained soldier. A Zulu warrior with an assegai needed to cross hundreds of yards of open ground under fire to even engage. The mathematics of death were insurmountable. Third, by July 1879, the Zulu military was exhausted. Months of warfare, the casualties at battles like Kambula, the strain on food supplies and social systems, all had taken their toll. The warriors who attacked at Ulundi were as brave as those who had triumphed at Isandlwana, but they were tired, their numbers depleted, and they faced a much better prepared enemy. Finally, there was a profound psychological dimension. The British came to Ulundi seeking redemption and revenge. They were determined not to repeat the humiliation of Isandlwana. The Zulu, defending their capital, fought with desperate courage, but also with the growing recognition that this might be a battle they could not win. The Battle of Ulundi represents a crucial turning point in South African history. It marked the end of the last major independent African kingdom in the region and paved the way for complete British colonial domination. Within a few years, the entire area would be incorporated into British South Africa, eventually becoming part of Natal Province. For the Zulu people, Ulundi was a catastrophe from which they never fully recovered politically. The proud military tradition, the centralized kingdom, the independence, all were lost. The Zulu became subjects rather than citizens of their own land. Their culture gradually eroded by colonial policies and economic pressures. Yet in some ways, the Zulu military tradition's reputation was enhanced rather than destroyed by the war. The courage displayed at Isandlwana, and even in defeat at Ulundi, earned respect even from their enemies. Victorian Britain, with its admiration for martial valor, came to romanticize the Zulu warrior. This romanticization was problematic. It often erased the complex political and social realities of the Zulu Kingdom, but it ensured that Zulu military achievements would not be forgotten. The battle also had wider implications for British imperialism. While Britain ultimately won the Anglo-Zulu War, the cost in lives, money, and prestige led to questions about the wisdom and morality of such colonial adventures. The easy confidence of imperial expansion received a significant check. From a military history perspective, Ulundi demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional African military systems when confronting industrial-age European forces. The Zulu tactical system was sophisticated and effective within its context, but it couldn't overcome the firepower disparity. This pattern would repeat across Africa as European colonization accelerated in the late 19th century. Interestingly, some military historians argue that the Zulu at Ulundi had no good options. To not fight would be to surrender their capital without resistance, culturally unthinkable. But to fight was to face certain slaughter. The British had engineered a situation where the Zulu were militarily trapped. The greatest Zulu defeat was not simply a military loss. It was the end of an era, the collapse of a kingdom, and the destruction of a way of life. On that July morning in 1879, when Zulu warriors charged into British rifle fire, they were fighting for more than territory. They were fighting for their independence, their culture, their identity. They lost that battle. The firepower disparity was too great, the British preparations too thorough. But their courage was never in question. Even British soldiers, in their letters and memoirs, expressed admiration for the Zulu warriors who advanced so fearlessly into certain death. The Battle of Ulundi stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of colonialism and the tragedy of military conflict. It represents a moment when one world died and another, colonially dominated one, was born. The Zulu Kingdom, which had seemed so powerful just months earlier at Isandlwana, was broken. Today, the battlefield at Ulundi is quiet. Memorial stones mark where thousands died. The royal kraal has long since disappeared, though reconstructions give modern visitors a sense of what once stood there. It's a place of reflection, where one can contemplate the courage of warriors who fought for their homeland and the terrible efficiency of modern warfare. The greatest Zulu defeat teaches us about the dangers of military overconfidence, the importance of adapting tactics to technological realities, and the brutal effectiveness of industrial-age weapons. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of the human beings behind the history. The Zulu warriors who died defending their kingdom, the British soldiers who followed orders into a foreign land, and a king who watched his world collapse. History remembers victories, but it's the defeats that often teach us the most. Ulundi was more than a battlefield. It was the graveyard of Zulu independence and the birthplace of a new, colonially dominated Southern Africa.